Hey, welcome back. People spend months planning the perfect vacation. For the tourists in today's episode, one unbelievably stupid decision made it their last. From a man who drowned because of life jackets, to a tourist who squeezed into a World War II tunnel for the perfect photo, only to realize turning around was no longer an option. It was Saturday, April 12th, 2021. Kuta Beach carried the usual afternoon noise. Vendors calling out surf lessons, tourists queuing for temporary tattoos, a lifeguard tower half shaded by a leaning umbrella. The tide sat calm, greenish blue, broken only by surfboards drifting near the shallows and a mild current tugging sand from underfoot. Among the crowd was Romeo Eleazar, 28, from Antwerp, Belgium. He worked as a warehouse supervisor back home, a job he was good at but never talked about much. What he loved was filming himself doing silly, harmless stunts for his private social media page, the kind only 40 or 50 friends ever saw. He wasn't chasing fame. He just wanted one video people would replay. Romeo was well liked, loud in a friendly way, the type who turned dares into inside jokes. He had no history of recklessness beyond vacation antics, like jumping off boats or eating suspiciously spicy street food on camera. He was strong, not athletic, comfortable in water but never trained in it. That afternoon, he noticed beach vendors renting cheap foam life jackets, $5 each. He joked that if one jacket kept a person afloat, 20 should make him unsinkable. His friends laughed and dared him to try. Vendors, unaware of each other, kept renting him more. By the time he stopped, Romeo wore 24 life jackets stacked over his shoulders and chest. The foam pinned his elbows outward, and the stack of life jackets held his chin high against his chest. Two vendors warned him not to go into the water because the jackets would make swimming almost impossible. Romeo waved them off, insisting he was going to prove them wrong. His friends laughed and filmed as he stepped into the sea. And by this point, it's just crazy how stubborn we can get when we just want to prove a point. The moment his feet left the sandbar, the stacked foam shot him upward like a buoy. Everyone laughed, Romeo included. Then a moderate rip current caught him sideways. He tried kicking back toward shore, but his shoulders couldn't move inside the foam. Each kick only spun him farther around instead of toward land. A wave rolled over him and tumbled him forward into the water. The stack of bulky life jackets didn't force him face down, but it did lock his shoulders and arms in place. He thrashed, trying to roll himself upright, yet the thick layers of foam around his chest and shoulders left him without enough range of motion to twist his body back over. Each small wave kept him in the same helpless position, and every attempt to recover failed. From the beach, his friends assumed he was still joking, floating dramatically for the camera. By the time one of them swam out to check, Romeo had drifted past the marked swimming boundary, his body now limp between waves. And that delay is the scariest part, when everyone just thinks it is part of the show. A lifeguard spotted Romeo floating motionless and immediately sounded the alarm. Rescue swimmers reached him quickly, but the tightly strapped life jackets had to be cut away before they could pull him free. Paramedics arrived soon afterward, but Romeo never regained consciousness. Several tourists recorded parts of the rescue, and the footage was later reviewed by local police. The post-mortem found that Romeo died from drowning after becoming trapped upside down in the water. Water was found in his lungs, and bruising around his ribs matched the tight straps of the stacked life jackets. Doctors concluded the extra layers had restricted his upper body so severely that once the waves rolled him over, he could not turn himself upright before inhaling water. Police confirmed the stunt was entirely voluntary after interviewing Romeo's friends. The videos recorded on their phones were turned over to investigators, but were never publicly released at his family's request. His social media accounts were deleted a few weeks later. After authorities completed the post-mortem, Romeo's body was released to the Belgian consulate and flown back to Antwerp, where he was buried in a small family funeral attended by relatives and close friends. The incident received only brief coverage in regional Indonesian news, and within days, it disappeared from public attention. Now, the next tourist would make a similar mistake, believing a giant inflatable ball couldn't possibly hurt them. By the time they realized it could, they were already floating toward a death they couldn't escape. It was Tuesday, September 18th, 2018. The morning fog sat low over the valley, curling around the old stone cliffs like smoke that refused to rise. Civita di Bagnoregio woke slowly, its narrow stone streets still damp from the night cleaning crews, shopkeepers rolling up metal shutters, an old man sweeping dust off his doorstep while a stray cat watched from a windowsill. Honestly, it feels like the kind of quiet, peaceful place where nothing bad is ever supposed to happen. Two backpackers stood near the town's edge. Noel Dravik, 26, and Kai LaRue, 27, were Canadian travelers 3 weeks into a 6-month trip across Europe. Noel was loud and impulsive, always filming everything for social media. Kai, a former mechanical engineering student, was quieter and more cautious but often went along with Noel's ideas. They had bought an inflatable Zorb weeks earlier, planning to use it on grassy hills. Instead, they reached Civita, a town perched on a crumbling plateau with steep cobblestone streets. Looking down one long downhill lane, Noel called it Italy's longest video game track. According to the investigation report, a shop owner nearby actually warned them that the stones turned dangerously slick after the morning washdown, particularly near the steep downhill approach leading toward the town's outer overlook. Another local pointed to the sharp bend beside the old public fountain, explaining that tourists sometimes slipped there even while walking. However, Noel ignored the warning and started unzipping the ball right away. Kai hesitated for a second, looking down at the internal harness straps, but ended up climbing in anyway when Noel called him slow. Neither of them even bothered to buckle in. That right there is where things take a turn, just ignoring all the red flags. Someone gave the Zorb a shove. It rolled faster than either man expected, the incline steeper than it looked from above. Every raised cobblestone sent the sphere bouncing, throwing both men against the plastic walls, then into each other, then off the walls again. Within seconds, neither could tell which direction was down. Noel struck his head against the inner shell near a seam. The ball slammed into the stone edge surrounding the fountain, ripping open part of a welded seam near the bottom. Instead of stopping, it bounced over the curb, smashed through a wooden safety barrier, rolled down the steep embankment, and splashed into a rain-filled drainage basin below. The sphere stayed afloat, but the entry zipper remained shut and twisted beneath the weight of both occupants. Investigators found Noel unconscious with a head wound as muddy water poured through the torn seam. Kai, dazed but awake, desperately pulled at the jammed zipper, but the unstable floating sphere kept throwing him off balance. Each attempt ended with his feet slipping across the slick plastic as more water rushed inside. I cannot even imagine the panic of being trapped inside something like that. Onlookers above the ravine paused to film, assuming the drifting sphere was just a stunt or promotional video as it floated in the basin below. Nobody climbed down right away. Nearly 20 minutes later, a municipal maintenance worker checking the drainage channels spotted the ball, now partially filled with water. He called emergency services, and firefighters arrived within minutes, cutting through the shell with rescue knives. Both men were pulled out unresponsive. That delay by the crowd is just heartbreaking to think about. The post-mortem found that both men drowned. Noel's head injury had rendered him unconscious before the water rose, while Kai had only minor bruises. Investigators concluded he couldn't escape because the jammed zipper, the shifting sphere, and the lack of anything to brace against trapped him until the water reached his face. Authorities later installed additional barriers along the overlook and reminded visitors that recreational equipment was prohibited in the historic center. It just goes to show how one silly idea can ruin everything in a matter of seconds. Kai couldn't reach the zipper that would have saved him, but the next tourist could have let go just as easily, but she didn't. It was Wednesday, October 6th, 2021. A hot air balloon destination in Turkey sat under a pale gray sky. Tourists gathered along the ridge with coffee cups and cameras as dozens of hot air balloons waited below, their burners still unlit while crews checked the lines. Long before that morning, Celine Moreau had built a life around beautiful moments. At 29 years old, from Belgium, she worked as a freelance wedding stylist, known for her patience with brides and her eye for fabric that moved well in photographs. She had recently started posting travel content online, nothing viral, just a few thousand followers who watched her chase sunrise light across famous landmarks. We all know people who love sharing their trips online, trying to capture that one perfect shot to show everyone back home. She spent nearly half her yearly income on these shoots, treating each destination like a stage rather than a place to visit. Friends teased that she picked vacations based on which dress she wanted to wear, not which sights she wanted to see. Cappadocia had been on her list for over a year, ever since she saw a photo of a bride standing above a valley full of balloons. For this trip, Celine commissioned a custom crimson silk gown with a 30-foot train, built specifically to spread across stone and catch the wind. On the morning of the shoot, the local photographer warned her that the air near the cliffs shifted quickly once the sun hit the canyon walls and suggested shortening the train for safety. Celine refused. She had paid over 2,000 euros for the dress and wanted every inch of it visible in the frame. The photographer suggested moving farther from the cliff so the balloons would still fill the background. A park ranger also reminded Celine not to cross the marked viewing area. She ignored both warnings, determined to get the exact shot she had imagined. It is tough when someone gets their heart set on an idea and refuses to listen to common sense warnings. Before sunrise, she climbed past the marked stones onto the narrow ledge despite a ranger calling after her to stay inside the designated viewing area. Balloons began lifting off below as two friends spread the crimson train across the rock for the photographer. Just as the countdown began, a balloon fired its burner, and a warm thermal gust lifted the long silk train. The photographer immediately told Celine to step away from the edge and forget about the dress. Instead, worried the fabric was ruining the shot, Celine reached down to straighten it. She took one step backward without looking, her heel sliding on loose volcanic gravel scattered across the worn stone. Witnesses said she held on to the dress instead of throwing it aside to catch herself. That instinct to hold on to your belongings instead of focusing on your footing can happen to anyone in a panic. She staggered toward the edge and caught herself on a jagged rock, but instead of letting go of the heavy train, she was still clutching it as she tried to regain her balance. The fabric wrapped around her legs, and a second later, she slipped again. This time, nothing stopped her. Celine fell about 120 feet down the rocky slope. The torn crimson train separated from her and caught on shrubs below. The photographer immediately called Turkish emergency services, while nearby balloon pilots radioed her location to rescuers. The post-mortem found severe head trauma, multiple broken ribs, and a shattered pelvis, injuries consistent with a fall onto uneven rock. Doctors concluded the head injury was immediately fatal. There was no evidence of a medical emergency before the fall. She died from the impact alone. Investigators ruled the death an accidental fall, citing her decision to ignore multiple safety warnings, cross the designated viewing line, and stay near the edge as the main contributing factors. No criminal charges were filed. The photographer later said the wind that morning was typical for the canyon. The accident wasn't caused by unusual weather, but by remaining on an exposed ledge after repeated warnings. Wind and silk brought Celine down. The next one needed neither, just a crack in bronze that was already there before he climbed on. It was Tuesday, June 7th, 2016. A busy public square in Krakow bustled with tourists weaving between pigeons and vendors selling amber jewelry. Nearby, a bronze equestrian statue stood behind low iron barriers, its surface dulled by decades of rain and pollution. It's the kind of busy, ordinary afternoon where nobody expects a single tourist photo to turn completely wrong. Chasing a better shot for his travel blog, 31-year-old Silas Rourke had spent the morning photographing rooftops and cobblestone alleys around the old town. He worked as a freelance photographer, the kind who built a modest following by turning ordinary landmarks into dramatic backdrops. Friends described him as charming but restless, always hunting the next angle that would outdo the last one he posted. Silas had backpacked through 6 countries that year alone, funding the trip through sponsored posts and print sales. He was confident in his balance, having free-climbed fences and rooftops before without injury. That confidence, paired with a need for content that stood out, made him dismiss rules meant for people less certain of themselves. That afternoon, Silas noticed the statue's knee-high barrier was easy to step over. Wanting more than an ordinary travel photo, he climbed over while both companions filmed on their phones. He pulled himself onto the horse's back using the rider's boot and stirrup, then asked if the shot looked exciting enough. With his friends watching, Silas began rocking side to side as if the horse were galloping. A nearby guide immediately shouted for him to get down, warning that the protected monument was never meant to be climbed. Silas ignored the warning and waved at the gathering onlookers as his friends kept filming. Several more pedestrians called out, some annoyed, some simply worried he'd fall. Rather than stopping, he exaggerated the movement for a few more seconds, hoping for one last memorable shot, unaware that the section beneath him had never been built to hold a bouncing adult. It is crazy how easily we brush off warnings when we think we are completely in control. The horse's main body held firm, because bronze that thick doesn't give. What gave was the decorative saddle piece jutting from its back, a thin cast section meant only to suggest tack and leather, not bear weight. Under Silas's repeated shifting, a hairline stress crack that had likely existed for years finally split wide open with a sharp metallic crack heard by nearby vendors. The saddle section snapped away beneath him, and Silas's balance vanished in an instant. As the broken bronze piece tore free, he grabbed for the horse's neck, fingers sliding across the cold metal, but his body had already swung past the point of recovery. Onlookers on their phones captured both Silas and the detached bronze section dropping together as gravity carried him over the horse's flank and down toward the stone steps below. He fell nearly 15 feet, landing on his back and head against the granite steps with a sound multiple witnesses later described as a dull, heavy thud. The detached bronze saddle piece fell alongside him and struck his chest almost simultaneously with the impact. Blood began pooling beneath his head almost immediately, and his friends' phones kept recording, capturing the panic that followed. That moment of panic on camera is just heartbreaking to think about. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but he never regained consciousness. He was rushed to a nearby hospital, where doctors pronounced him dead from catastrophic head trauma. The post-mortem found a severe skull fracture and massive brain bleeding caused by the fall. Bruising on his chest matched the dislodged bronze piece, confirming it struck him after impact. Toxicology found no drugs or alcohol in his system. Local authorities ruled the death accidental, citing reckless misuse of a historic monument. His friends, who had been filming the stunt, were questioned by police but faced no criminal charges because investigators found no evidence they had physically encouraged or forced him onto the statue. The city's Heritage Office inspected the monument, which suffered only minor surface damage, and installed taller, reinforced barriers around it within weeks. Municipal officials later cited the incident during a broader review of safety measures at historical sites across the city. The next tourist didn't climb onto history, he crawled inside it, and that decision became the last one he ever made. It was Thursday, January 10th, 2019. Corregidor Island sat under a flat gray sky, the air thick with salt and old rust. Tour groups moved slowly between crumbling barracks, cameras raised, voices hushed by the weight of the place. Guides pointed out cracked walls and collapsed ceilings, warning everyone to stay on the marked paths. Honestly, walking through places like that gives you a strange feeling, like you are stepping back into history. Among the group that afternoon was Rylan Arthur Smith, 34. He worked as a freelance photographer specializing in abandoned military sites, chasing images most tourists never got close enough to take. Friends described him as fearless, sometimes reckless, always chasing the next dramatic shot for his growing online following. He had researched Corregidor for months, reading about its tunnels, its history, its danger. We all know someone who thinks rules do not apply to them because they are confident. Rylan believed rules were for people with less experience than him. He had explored collapsed mines in Bulacan and flooded bunkers in Bataan without getting hurt, and that record made him overconfident. The tour stopped at a sealed emergency escape shaft, narrow and unlit, permanently closed because it was structurally unstable. A section of rusted grating had been removed for conservation work, leaving a gap just wide enough for someone to squeeze through. Rylan spotted the opening immediately. He told his two companions he only wanted a quick photo from just inside. The guide ordered him to stay back, warning that the shaft was off limits and unsafe. Rylan slipped through the gap before the guide could reach him. By the time anyone tried to grab him, he had already disappeared into the darkness. It is just wild how fast someone can make a choice they can never take back. Inside, the shaft narrowed sharply after about 10 feet. His companions called after him, telling him to come back. Rylan answered that he could already see daylight ahead, convinced the exit was close. Instead of backing out while space still allowed it, he kept pushing forward, chest scraping against jagged concrete and loose stone. The passage narrowed again. His backpack caught on a jutting rock, so he pulled it off and shoved it ahead of him into the dark. His chest barely cleared the gap now, and turning became impossible in either direction. As he strained to pull himself forward, a portion of the deteriorated ceiling behind him gave way without warning, dropping rock and debris into the space he had just crawled through. Dust rolled backward out of the shaft opening, and his companions heard the collapse from outside. Rylan was pinned unable to move forward or backward, his chest and ribs pressed against unmoving stone on both sides. The guide immediately radioed park security while another visitor called local emergency services on his phone. Rescue teams arrived within 25 minutes, but breaking through the reinforced rock took nearly 2 hours before responders reached him. Recovery of his body required almost 3 additional hours of careful excavation. That wait must have felt like an absolute eternity for everyone standing outside. The autopsy found that Ryland died from compressional asphyxia, meaning the tight rock pressing on his chest stopped him from breathing properly over an extended period. Doctors noted bruising and rib fractures consistent with prolonged crushing pressure rather than a sudden single impact. There was no other significant trauma. The cause of death was straightforward: suffocating from entrapment. Local authorities classified the death as accidental, citing repeated disregard of posted warnings and a direct verbal order from tour staff. The heritage site's management announced that all remaining maintenance openings across the tunnel network would be permanently welded shut. Corregidor's Foundation issued a statement reminding visitors that closed areas remain closed for documented structural reasons, not formality. Not every tourist tragedy happens in isolation. The next unfolded in the middle of one of the world's most colorful celebrations. It was Friday, March 16th, 2022. Days before the main festival, Mathura's narrow lanes filled with color as vendors stacked bags of bright powder outside their shops. The city was already preparing for one of its busiest celebrations of the year. For someone who loved seeing places before everyone else did, it was the perfect morning. Among the visitors walking the old city alone was Chloe Arden, 29, an Australian travel writer who spent most of the year moving from one country to another. Instead of reviewing luxury hotels or famous attractions, she focused on overlooked streets, quiet neighborhoods, and viewpoints that rarely appeared in guidebooks. She kept detailed travel journals and often spent extra time looking for less familiar viewpoints. Taking the same photos as everyone else never interested her. I think that's something a lot of travelers can relate to, but looking for a better view is one thing. Ignoring a warning to get it? That's something else. She spent nearly an hour walking through the market looking for a high place to photograph the streets before the crowds became too dense. Every balcony overlooking the route was either occupied by families preparing for Holi or reserved for paying guests. As she continued searching, she noticed an exterior staircase leading to the flat roof of a small textile shop. Earlier that morning, the shop owner had already turned away several visitors, explaining that customers were not allowed upstairs because the roof had no protective railing and became slippery whenever colored powder drifted onto the concrete. Chloe overheard the warning while browsing scarves near the entrance. A rush of customers soon filled the store. While the owner helped them, Chloe quietly slipped through the side passage and climbed the staircase alone. The view at the top was exactly what she had been looking for. Below her, narrow streets stretched between old buildings as workers unloaded decorations and children tested handfuls of colored powder ahead of the festival. She unpacked her camera and slowly walked backward to widen the view. It's amazing how quickly a viewfinder can completely blind you to reality, turning a deadly drop into just another framing choice. The rooftop surface carried a thin layer of colored powder blown upward by the morning breeze. It blended almost perfectly with the pale concrete beneath it. As Chloe stepped backward near the roof's unfinished edge, her right shoe lost traction. She tried to recover with one quick step. However, her heel landed beyond the edge, and she dropped backward from the roof. On the way down, her body slammed into a metal electrical awning attached to the second floor. The impact bent the sheet metal with a violent crash that echoed through the street before she continued falling nearly 20 feet onto the stone pavement below. Her head struck first with tremendous force, and her camera bounced several feet away before coming to rest beside a market stall. For a brief moment, several people nearby assumed another bag of festival powder had burst overhead because of the cloud of colored dust released from the awning. A vegetable vendor was the first to realize someone had fallen. He rushed across the street while another shopkeeper immediately called emergency services and waved down a passing police patrol. Paramedics arrived minutes later. Chloe was unconscious and had suffered devastating head injuries. She was taken to a nearby hospital where doctors performed emergency treatment throughout the afternoon, but she died later that evening. The post-mortem examination found a massive fracture across the base and side of her skull, along with extensive bleeding inside her brain. crane. Doctors explained that although the collision with the metal awning caused additional trauma, the fatal injury occurred when her head struck the stone pavement. Aside from bruises and fractures caused by the fall, investigators found no evidence of any medical condition that contributed to the accident. Police ruled the death accidental. Investigators confirmed that the rooftop had not been open to the public and that the shop owner had verbally warned visitors earlier that morning not to go upstairs. In the months that followed, several businesses overlooking holy routes installed locked gates or permanent barriers to prevent unauthorized rooftop access during festival season. Chloe's travel notebooks recovered from her backpack at the hospital were eventually returned to her family in Australia, alongside a camera that preserved her final, tragic perspective, proving just how easily a search for the extraordinary can cost someone everything.